The wind cut like a blade across the desolate expanse, whistling through the skeletal branches of pine and tearing at the flimsy barrier of the makeshift lean-to. Inside, huddled against the biting cold, Sarah shivered. It wasn't just the frigid air that made her tremble. It was a deep, bone-seated fear, a constant companion since she'd fled. The snow, relentless and heavy, had erased her tracks hours ago, burying the last vestiges of her desperate flight, but it hadn't buried the specter of what she'd left behind, or who might be following. Every snap of a twig, every groan of the wind, sent a fresh wave of panic through her. She was alone, starving, and ill-equipped for the unforgiving wilderness of the high country in late autumn. Her fashionable city shoes were soaked through. Her thin coat offered little protection, and the small, leather-bound journal she clutched like a lifeline felt heavy with the weight of unspeakable secrets. Her breath plumed in ragged gasps, white against the gloom. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, subsisting on a few frozen berries found by chance. Her stomach ached with a hollow, gnawing pain, and a persistent cough racked her small frame. She knew, with a terrifying certainty, that she couldn't last much longer. Despair was a cold hand closing around her heart, tighter than the frost outside. She closed her eyes, picturing the face of the man she had run from, the righteous fury in his eyes, the damning accusations that had echoed in the hallowed halls of the life she'd once known. That world felt like a dream now, replaced by this stark, brutal reality. The cold was seeping into her very core, numbing her fingers and toes. She felt herself drifting, the edges of consciousness blurring. Was this it? To simply fade into the white, frozen landscape, her story untold, her burden unclaimed? A sudden, sharp sound pierced the wind's mournful howl. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunching on the snow. Her eyes snapped open, wide with terror. They had found her. After weeks of hiding, of running, they had found her. She pressed herself further into the lean-to, trying to disappear, to somehow melt into the snow and shadows. The steps came closer, stopping just outside the meager shelter. A shadow fell across the opening. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the harsh voice, the condemnation, the inevitable end of her flight. But no words came, only the sound of snow being brushed away, then a quiet rustle. She forced her eyes open a crack. A pair of worn, leather boots stood before the opening. Above them, a rough-hewn leg encased in canvas trousers. And then a hand, large and calloused, reached in, not towards her, but towards the fire she had managed to coax into a few embers earlier. It placed a small piece of dry kindling among the dying sparks. The gesture was so unexpected, so utterly devoid of threat, that for a moment, her fear gave way to bewildered confusion. She watched, frozen, as the hand carefully added more wood, shielding the nascent flame from the wind. The fire sputtered, then caught, casting a faint, flickering light. The man rose to his full height, blocking the wind from the opening. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the low light and the brim of a wide-brimmed hat dusted with snow. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge her directly. He simply moved with a quiet competence, clearing snow, reinforcing the lean-to with a fallen branch, his movements economical and practiced. Sarah watched him, her heart still pounding, but the edge of pure panic had dulled slightly. There was no aggression in his posture, no hint of recognition or pursuit. He was a stranger, seemingly stumbled upon her hiding place by chance, or perhaps drawn by the smoke she'd hoped would be invisible. He knelt by the fire, coaxing it into a steady flame. The warmth began to spread, a fragile shield against the pervasive cold. He reached into a pack and pulled out a strip of dried meat. Without a word, he held it out to her. She stared at it, then at him, uncertainty warring with desperate hunger. His face remained unreadable in the firelight. He wasn't offering it with pity or judgment, just offering it. Slowly, tentatively, she reached out a trembling hand and took it. The meat was tough, but it was food, real food. She tore off a piece and chewed, the unfamiliar texture and taste a jarring contrast to the emptiness in her stomach. He watched her eat for a moment, then turned his attention back to securing the shelter. He worked methodically, his breathing even, a stark contrast to her own ragged gasps. Who was he? A trapper? Prospector? He seemed utterly at home in this harsh landscape, a part of it in a way she could never be. She finished the meat, feeling a faint return of strength. He still hadn't spoken. The silence wasn't awkward, not exactly, but it was heavy with unspoken questions and assumptions. He finished reinforcing the lean-to, ensuring it would withstand the deepening storm. Then he settled down on the opposite side of the small fire, unspeaking. He pulled out a simple bedroll and laid it out. It was clear he intended to stay. Her initial terror had receded, replaced by a cautious wariness. Was this a trap? Had he been sent? But his actions seemed too genuine, too focused on practical survival to be a pretense. He looked at her then, his eyes finally meeting hers across the fire. They were dark and steady, conveying neither welcome nor hostility, just a quiet appraisal. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask why she was alone in the wilderness. He simply met her gaze, then shifted his own back to the fire. The unspoken question hung in the air. What would she do? Where would she go? She had no answers. For tonight, the most pressing question was simply survival. And this silent, capable stranger had, for reasons she couldn't fathom, offered a reprieve. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows that distorted the small space. Outside, the wind howled, a constant reminder of the world she had escaped and the world she was now in. The world of cold, fear, and a quiet man who had found her hiding in the snow. The next morning, the storm had abated, leaving behind a landscape blanketed in pristine white. Sarah woke stiff and sore, the meager warmth of the previous night having done little to banish the deep chill from her bones. The man was already awake, tending the fire and melting snow in a small pot. He offered her a cup of warm water. She accepted it gratefully, her chapped lips stinging from the heat. Still, he said nothing. The silence between them was becoming a language of its own, filled with observation and assumption. She watched him pack up his camp with efficient movements. He was lean but powerful, his face etched with the harsh lines of the wilderness, his hands strong and calloused. He carried a rifle with an easy familiarity that spoke of long use. He wasn't waiting for her. He was simply preparing to leave. He hoisted his pack onto his back and looked towards the direction he seemed intent on heading deeper into the mountains. He paused then, glancing back at her. His gaze lingered for a moment, searching, assessing. It wasn't a demanding look, but an expectant one. Was he offering her a choice? To stay and face the unknown alone in the wilderness, or to follow him into a different, equally unknown future? She knew she couldn't survive alone. The thought of another day trying to find food, another night exposed to the elements, filled her with dread. The danger she was running from was still out there, but in her current state, the wilderness was the more immediate threat. He turned to leave. "Wait," she croaked, her voice hoarse and weak from disuse and the cold. He stopped, turning his head slightly. I have nowhere to go." His expression didn't change. He didn't offer reassurance or express pity. He simply waited. Can I come with you?" The question felt fragile, hanging in the crisp morning air. He considered her for a long moment. His eyes, dark and unreadable, seemed to weigh her fragility against the demands of the journey ahead. He was silent for so long she thought he might refuse, might simply turn and walk away, leaving her to her fate. Finally, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "It's hard country," he said, his voice low and gruff, the first words she had heard him speak. "Harder than you know." It wasn't a welcome, but a warning, a statement of fact about the world he inhabited. "I understand," she lied, though she understood very little beyond the imperative to survive. He didn't challenge her claim. He simply turned and began to walk, setting a steady, relentless pace through the snow. She scrambled to gather the few pathetic belongings she had managed to keep, her frozen fingers fumbling with the thin blanket and her journal. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and hurried to follow him, stepping carefully in the tracks he left behind. The snow was deep, the air biting. Each step was an effort, her legs aching, her lungs burning in the cold air. He didn't slow down for her. He didn't look back to check on her progress. It was a test, she realized. A silent, physical assessment of her ability to keep up, to endure. She gritted her teeth and pushed forward, determined not to fail, not to be left behind. As they traveled, the days bled into a rhythm of hardship and silent cohabitation. They spoke rarely, and when they did, it was about practicalities. The weather, the terrain, the dwindling supplies. His name, she learned through a brief transactional exchange, was Jedediah. He asked for hers only after several days on the trail. Sarah, she replied, the sound of her own name foreign on her tongue after weeks of silence. He nodded, as if filing the information away, nothing more. He taught her, without explicit instruction, how to build a more substantial fire, how to identify edible plants, few in the late season, how to move quietly through the forest. She learned to read his moods not from his face, which remained largely impassive, but from the set of his shoulders, the tension in his hands, the pace of his stride. He was wary, always scanning their surroundings, his rifle always close at hand. His silence was not emptiness, but vigilance. She began to understand that the wilderness held its own dangers, stark and immediate, far removed from the complex, insidious threats of the society she had fled. Wolves, bears, the ever-present risk of injury or getting lost. Jedediah navigated these with a quiet confidence that was both unnerving and deeply reassuring. She, in turn, proved herself to be not entirely useless. Her initial weakness slowly gave way to a nascent resilience. She learned to conserve her energy, to mend torn clothing with a needle and thread from her small kit, to boil water over the fire. She still clung to her journal, writing in it whenever they stopped, the act a small rebellion against the anonymity of her new existence, a way to hold onto the fragmented pieces of herself. One evening, huddled by the fire, the wind picking up again, she coughed violently, the sound tearing through the quiet night. Jedediah looked over, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. He didn't say anything, but he reached into his pack and pulled out a small tin. He scooped out a dark, pungent salve and held it out to her. "Rub it on your chest," he said, his voice still low. She hesitated, then took the tin. The salve was cold and greasy, but it smelled faintly of pine and something medicinal. She applied it as directed, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and embarrassment. It was the first unsolicited kindness he had shown her, a small crack in his stoic facade. Another day, while crossing a narrow, icy creek, her foot slipped. She cried out, losing her balance and plunging into the frigid water. The shock stole her breath. Before she could fully register what was happening, Jedediah was there, pulling her out with a strength that belied his lean frame. He didn't scold her. He simply helped her to shore, his movements quick and efficient. He immediately built a large fire and insisted she strip off her wet clothes, offering her his spare blanket while her things dried. He turned his back while she changed, a small gesture of privacy in their exposed existence. Standing wrapped in his rough wool blanket, watching her meager garments steam by the fire, Sarah felt a profound sense of vulnerability, but also something new, a fragile sense of safety she hadn't felt since before she ran. The fragile piece of their shared existence shattered one afternoon when they stumbled upon a small, run-down cabin nestled in a remote valley. As they approached, Sarah saw signs of recent occupation. Smoke from the chimney, faint tracks in the snow that weren't their own. Jedediah immediately grew still, his hand going instinctively to his rifle. A moment later, two figures emerged from the cabin, rough-looking men whose eyes narrowed as they saw the strangers. Sarah's blood ran cold. These men weren't simply inhabitants of the wilderness. There was a predatory air about them, a careless cruelty in their gazes that reminded her of the kind of men who had haunted the edges of the life she'd left. One of them recognized her. A gasp, then a cruel, slow smile spread across his face. "Well, looky here, Lyle," he sneered, addressing his companion. Seems our little runaway bird didn't fly far enough. He took a step towards her, his eyes glinting with malice. He's been looking for you, girl. Says you stole from him. The accusation hung heavy in the air, a gross distortion of the truth, but one that carried weight out here. Jedediah stepped slightly in front of Sarah, his rifle held casually but purposefully. She's with me, he stated, his voice low and steady, devoid of threat but brimming with quiet authority. The men laughed. With you? Seems you've picked up damaged goods, mister. She's got a price on her head. You know, Sarah felt a wave of nausea wash over her. They knew. The past she had tried so desperately to outrun had finally caught up to her. She could see the calculation in the men's eyes, the reward money, the vulnerability of a lone woman, the possibility of overpowering the silent man beside her. Jedediah didn't flinch. He simply held their gaze, his body language conveying a readiness they seemed to underestimate. The man who had spoken first took another step forward, his hand moving towards a knife sheath. Step aside, friend. This don't concern you. It concerned him now. It concerned him the moment he chose not to abandon her in the snow. Sarah knew, with a certainty that solidified her fear into resolve, that she couldn't stand by and watch him face these men alone, not when she was the reason they were here. She reached into her coat pocket, her fingers closing around the small, heavy object she had kept hidden. It was a derringer, a last desperate means of defense. It felt cold and unfamiliar in her hand. The second man, Lyle, started to circle around, trying to get behind Jedediah. Easy now, he said, but his eyes were on Sarah, appraising. The first man lunged. Jedediah moved with surprising speed, bringing the butt of his rifle up to block the attack. A grunt of pain, a scramble in the snow. Sarah raised the derringer, her hand trembling violently. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had never fired a gun in her life. But the look in the men's eyes, the sheer viciousness of their intent, stripped away her hesitation. She wouldn't go back. Not alive. And she wouldn't let Jedediah be harmed because of her. The sound of a struggle, Jedediah parrying blows, the other man closing in. Sarah took a shaky breath, aimed the small pistol towards the second man, who was now rushing her, and pulled the trigger. The shot was deafening in the quiet clearing. Lyle stumbled back, clutching his arm, his eyes wide with disbelief and pain. The distraction was all Jedediah needed. He landed a brutal blow, sending the first man sprawling into the snow, momentarily stunned. The confrontation was over as quickly as it began. The two men, wounded and clearly unprepared for such resistance from their intended prey, stumbled back, muttering threats and curses. Jedediah stood firm, his rifle ready, ensuring they didn't attempt another attack. They retreated towards the cabin, disappearing inside, no doubt to lick their wounds and plot their next move. Jedediah didn't pursue them. He watched the cabin for a long moment, then turned to Sarah. Her hand was still shaking, clutching the now empty derringer. Her face felt cold, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had shot someone. The reality of it was slow to sink in, overshadowed by the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Jedediah gently took the derringer from her trembling hand. He looked at it, then back at her, his gaze unreadable. "You all right?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. She could only nod, tears pricking at her eyes, a mixture of fear, shock, and a strange, fierce pride swelling within her. She had acted. She hadn't frozen. For the first time, she hadn't run. He didn't pry into her past, didn't ask why those men knew her, didn't ask about the theft they accused her of. The events of the last few minutes had forged a new understanding between them, one that bypassed words. They were allies now, bound by shared danger. "We can't stay here," he stated simply. She agreed without hesitation. They moved quickly, leaving the cabin and its hostile occupants behind, pushing deeper into the mountains as dusk began to fall. The journey was arduous, but different now. Sarah walked with a new purpose, her fear tempered by the knowledge of her own capacity for action. She had faced a tangible threat and responded, not as a helpless victim, but as someone fighting for her life, for her freedom. Jedediah remained her silent protector, but he also treated her with a quiet respect she hadn't earned through words, but through action. He shared the burden of breaking trail through the deep snow. He ensured she ate. He watched over her sleep. His solitude was no longer a wall between them, but a space they shared, punctuated by the crackle of the fire, the howl of the wind, the steady rhythm of their footsteps. As they journeyed on, the harsh landscape seemed less an enemy and more a testing ground. Sarah's resilience, forged in the crucible of fear and hardship, grew stronger with each passing day. The past was still a shadow, but it no longer consumed her entirely. She carried its weight, but she also carried the weight of her own survival, her own courage. She had been a woman running from her past, found by a man running from. What? He never said. But in this shared journey through unimaginable challenges, they had found something unexpected in each other, not love, perhaps. Not in the way she had once understood it, but a profound, quiet connection built on necessity, respect, and shared endurance. They were two solitary figures against the vast, indifferent wilderness, no longer alone. The journey ahead was still uncertain, still fraught with peril, but facing it together, under the wide, indifferent sky, felt less like an end and more like a beginning. They had survived the storm, the hunger, the pursuit. They had faced down cruelty and found strength in unity. Sarah had fled a life built on deceit and judgment, only to find a truer sense of self and belonging in a world stripped bare of pretension, alongside a man of few words but deep, quiet strength. Their path was their own now, winding through the mountains, a testament to resilience, whispered on the wind.